Ronin, wanderers without destinations, warriors without a cause, servants without a master. For real, guys, these lampshade-toting dudes they conjure so many images in one's mind, and one afternoon I got randomly inspired to just combine this mysterious wandering warrior with a Space Marine. This is what happens when you play Ghost of Tsushima and Space Marine 2 back to back. And so, with a few different Space Marine kits, a couple of pictures of Jin Sakai looking mighty fine in that Wanderer outfit, and no real plan, let's do this. I went for the sleeker body of a Phobos armored Space Marine, and I decided to take the quick draw pistol arm in order to make him doing a quick draw of his sword, which is exactly the kind of pose one imagines from a character such as this. Next came making the actual scabbard of the sword, or a saya as it's called for a Japanese sword, but unfortunately Space Marines have a nasty habit of only having straight swords, so I had to doctor something up, of course. I got the scabbard from a Blade Guard veteran and the knife sheath from a Primaris Reaver, and I got to sticking them together after taking the grenades off, of course. It was going to require some work trying to get them to look like they're actually bent and flowing together and not just two straight things stuck together. So for this, thankfully, I was going to make some avid good use of green stuff, because with that we can at least create the illusion of a bend, where I can only take it so far in the plastic itself. I mean, granted, I was trying to bend it, and it did kind of work, but green stuff was going to be the thing that took it all the way. Speaking of bending things, I was also trying to curve the edges of the scabbard around, more like a katana's sire. Yeah, you can see what I mean there about how it's like two straight things stuck together at the moment, rather than one curved piece, but still a promising start. So, I now dug into my collection of random bits that I got on eBay, and after sifting through some interesting weapons, I was to eventually find something that would be quite useful. Something that this fella would need in order to draw his sword. That being, of course, a sword hilt. Thankfully, I had this lovely, lovely spear, specifically the haft of it, which I knew was going to make an excellent sword hilt for him to perform a quick draw with this definitely oversized sword, but hey-ho. Though before I could attach the hilt, first we had to attach the tsuba, which is the sword guard of a Japanese sword. Thankfully, all it would take was a little green stuff in order to make a nice, stylish tsuba for this guy. And at this point, we can now attach the hilt. And it's looking very, very dope. But we need to work on that bend, so I wrapped around it in green stuff. Now, I knew that it wouldn't have a perfectly solid look, if you would, like an actual sword scabbard. So, in the end, I was going to go with the idea that it's wrapped in some kind of material, cloth, maybe even clay, who knows. But with that, it was stuck to the body and starting to look, it really looked the part, for lack of a better word. It was at this point that I realized I really need to make sure the backpack actually fits, which thankfully it did, albeit by a very close margin. So at this point I then stuck him to the base so I could stand him up, and then started snipping out the most important piece to this puzzle, the cape. Because you can't be a traveller without a cape. It took a bit of snipping and doctoring, but I got it sitting pretty naturally underneath his backpack. And I was going to make a good use of both green stuff and plastic cement in order to get it to stick in there. And with the excess cleared out, we got ourselves looking really on point now. So when it came to his other hand, I still wanted him to have a bolt gun because they're very, they're very Space Marine, aren't they? So, but the real trouble was finding an arm that suited it. Some were too straight or even too bent. It was just trying to get it to look just right. That was the real trouble. But eventually, I found one that looked pretty good, like he's in the middle of an action pose. Now, I knew exactly what head I wanted, that Reaver mask, it's dope, but we needed something else, that typical straw hat from Ronin. Thankfully, I very quickly found exactly what I was looking for. It's like fate wanted me to find it. I love it when that happens. So with a little bit of doctoring, snipping off the extra bits and whatnot, it's a little too scaven at the moment, and a bit of trimming down, and then a little bit of doctoring to make sure it would fit nicely, like drilling a nice dink right in there so his head can sit in. But then, of course, his head was still a bit funky, so I actually just gave him a bit of a trim off the top there, so that way it looked like he's wearing the hat, not that it's perched on the top of his head. And with that done, all he needs now is that sweet, sweet pauldron. Just the sleek one, of course. Alright then, and with him done and dandy, he is looking really, really quite dope. I'm very, very proud of him. Sure, he's a little rough around the edges in some case, especially around the sire, the scabbard of his sword. But in the end, I'm going to find a way to make that work with him. Also, the blade guard also looking pretty rough because I had to do a lot of reworks on that because it kept bending out of place by accident for many reasons. But again, all part of the lore, part of the story. It's an ancient sword. It is an ancient sword, you see. I decided he is the last of his chapter, and he has the sword of his old chapter master, and he goes around the Imperium righting whatever wrongs he does see fit. Were they traitors and he is the last of the loyalist lot? Who knows? Who knows? Lore is definitely something we'll need to come up with for this guy down the line. Now, before we continue, I want to give a huge thank you to my YouTube members and my Patreon members, especially my Patreon lieutenants, whose names you can see on screen right now. It is your support that allows me to keep learning this hobby of mine and hopefully encourage other new painters to pick up the hobby or to continue their growth as I am. Anyways, let's continue onwards. Thank you again. Now, he needs a little splash of colour, and I knew exactly what we had to start with, when it came to priming anyway. He needed a nice black coat. And from this we can spring on to the first colour, Balthazar Gold. Yes, because I wanted him to have a sort of metallic base to begin with. These were only going to be the colours of the, like the rims of things and whatnot, and the hat, of course, as well, because I know it's usually a straw hat, but he's a Space Marine, so it's going to be all armoured and whatnot, so we went for metal with that. I went for a bronze that combines the travelling earthiness of a Ronin with the armoured blasé of a Space Marine. Next came Mephiston Red, which I was going to mix with some contrast medium in order to give it a painted-on look, if you would. Because I wanted it to look like he's kind of painted over his armor at some point, just to add to the mystique of this guy. Plus, it allows some of the metallics to shine through, so he looks armored the whole way through, which is super dope. Now, of course, it is looking pretty bright at the moment, but this is going to be toned down later when we get to the shading. But in a way, I do kind of like the really bright, again, blasé look of it, but that's just me. Loud and garish. In continuation of these really dope earthy tones, we went for Rhinox Hide for his cape. Now this, in my opinion, is when it really started to all come together. You have the bronze, you have the reds, and now you have the browns. You've got some really autumnal colours going here. You can just imagine those fallen yellow leaves just swirling around him. Were I skilled enough, I probably would have done that for a base, but regardless, he's looking super, super cool. Briefly jumping back to classic metallic looks for Space Marines, I was going to have his bolt gun be the classic black and lead belcher, you know, just because I wanted to give the vibe that it's a fairly bog-standard gun. But of course, I was still going to add some elements of his colour scheme to it, like the grip, I was going to have it be the bronze, and a few elements of like the scope, for instance, just so that way it isn't too much of a departure from the rest of him. Now for his sword, I began by coating some of it white, mainly just the Sire and the Tsuba, the blade guard as well, because again, this was the sword of his chapter master way back when, and this guy has repainted his armor since then, so I decided to go for a different color, but not one that departs so much. The beauty of white is that it kind of goes with anything, really. Plus, again, once we add the shading, it's going to darken the brightness of that white down, so it won't be overly garish when the time comes. Now, when it comes to the green stuff that I wrapped around the blade itself to give it that curved look, now, it's janky, I ain't gonna lie, of course it's janky, so to go with that jank, I decided that we're going to paint it Mournfang brown in order to make it look not like cloth, but like clay. He's wrapped it up in clay. Why exactly has he done this? Maybe he's trying to keep it safe and secure, maybe it's just old and needs that extra protection, maybe he's trying to keep it hidden or something, maybe this is holy clay, maybe it had something to do with his chapter. Who really knows? But regardless, he's got that mocha brown clay wrapped around this sword that he does love so much. And to be fair, a sword like that, I'd love it too. But so far, yes, pretty good. After also whiting up the pommel of the sword, which I forgot to do, I won't lie to you, we then finally started on the shading. And this was going to begin with Agrax Earthshade to really go down that earthy route that I said. So the beauty of shading this guy is that it's actually going to bring down the shine of the metals, make it look like it's, well worn, which is exactly what we're looking for a traveler like this. But this is the beginning of the part where I keep seeing things I'd forgotten to do. I then remember he has a mask underneath that cookie hat. I decided to go for white for that as well, to give it that sort of ghost look, you know, like a phantom, which is definitely the kind of vibe that I'm aiming for here. Before I resumed shading with the Agrax Earthshade, I realized there were a few other things that I missed, such as his pouches and belts and straps and whatnot needing to be brown. And in addition as well, I wanted to put some gold on his sword. I'd meant to do it earlier after the white had dried, but I'd completely forgotten because I'm a silly boy. So I bust out the old Retributor armour and then got those gold bits done, and then continued on with the shading. And with that shading done, it's really starting to come together. For me, shading is my favourite part of the whole process, because that's when it starts to look, okay, now I'm starting to see some of the shadows, and then of course, now we just need some of those highlights. And to begin those highlights, we're going to start with Genna's gold for the bronzes, to bring back some of those reflective bits, you know, where the sunlight really catches it. And there were so many lovely little edges to grab hold of, you know what I mean? It just really helps bring it to life. And I think the biggest challenge really was actually the top of the hat, because I wanted to get a few of those edges on the cookie bits without going into the recesses, so I had to very gently scrape over the top of that with the flat of my brush. But in the end, it all worked very, very well, and it started to look really quite gorgeous. But the next one we used, the next color, was Wild Rider Red. So for these highlights, there weren't actually that many edges to highlight. There was like some on the knees, the shoulders, a bit on the side of the breastplate, but other than that, it was a lot of curved panels. So I had to make some good use of my recently founded stippling skills, which, well, I don't know if skills is the right word just yet, but either way, I was able to get some nice gradients on his shoulders especially, and certain parts of the backpack, and along his legs and arms and whatnot. And while my skills at stippling still need a lot of work, I feel it really did help, just with this little bit, to really push the model that much further, and I'm really pleased with the results. Next came highlighting for the third of the Holy Trinity here, which is the cape, for which I used Doombull Brown. Now, I haven't really actively spent time learning much about highlighting fabrics and whatnot, but I find that whenever I do, it seems to turn out really well. Obviously, the more experienced painters out there, please do correct me if I'm just deluding myself here, but I'm able to sort of get some nice sweeping highlights over the back wherever the fabric folds or creases over itself or whatnot, and I'm just really proud of how it looks. And in addition to where the fabric flows, I also did, of course, the actual edges of the cape itself. And it's really starting to take some excellent shapes now. Next came the Auric Armor Gold. This was not just to highlight the gold itself on the sword, but also to highlight the bronze of the armor itself, but only the highest highlights, the most specular of them. So the most raised edges, the most on display parts of the bronze, if you would. Although I must point out, on the backpack, just near the bottom where it V's in towards the bottom, I put way too much on there by accident, and then the moment I tilt the camera in a certain way, you can just see it shining like V for Vendetta blinging out or something. So I basically had to redo that little bit from the start. You know, slapping on the bronze and shading it and then putting on the lower highlights there. But that's fine, you know, that's just part of the hobby. When you make a mistake, you can just go over that part again. Most of the time, anyway. But don't be afraid to. You know, making mistakes is how we learn. So never be afraid of making mistakes. Because I guarantee, if you learn from it, your reattempt will only be better. So next was kind of a plethora of different things that I either needed to do or forgot to do, such as doing the final highlights on the cape with Tuskgore fur, adding in a little bit of gold detail in the corner as well, because he has that symbols there in the corner, doesn't he? Then using Corax White to highlight the shaded Corax White on the sword, give him a little bit of silver detailing under the hats, like the electronics on the side of his head and whatnot, and then adding Doombull Brown highlights to the bags and belts there. Then, of course, I move on to highlighting the bolt gun by giving the classic black highlights of Eshin Grey, followed by Dawnstone. And with all those bits done, this guy, he's basically done at this point. I may have missed a few bits here or there, but I'd like to think that they are hidden away enough or not important enough to really not be noticed. So, now there's one thing left to do. The base. Now in my mind's eye, what I would have loved to have done would have been some swirling red and yellow leaves, you know, that kind of mythic Japanese aspect. But frankly, I have neither the know-how nor the confidence to attempt such a thing. So, in the end, I decided to just go for a straightforward grass look. This began with some sterling mud. Nice simple thing to apply, an excellent technical which I do enjoy. And then once that was dry, I grabbed me my static meadow grass and some PVA glue that dries clear. I spread the PVA glue nicely over the whole base where the mud is, and then effectively just loosened up and dunked the model into the grass pot. And then shook any excess off good and hard until all that was left was the sticking up static grass. I think it looks so cool. I've used this a couple of times, and I won't lie, I was initially a little bit worried, oh, is green grass going to make this Christmassy? You got the reds, the golds, and the greens. It's going to be kind of Christmassy, but it wasn't. It really wasn't, and I'm so pleased that I did it. So all that needed to be done now was the rim of the base. I could have gone for black, but I decided not to. I thought that would, oddly enough, be a bit too striking. So I decided instead to go for the other classic of Steel Legion Drab. First, I scraped around the edge with my knife to get any of the excess grass off, because as you can imagine, it really was trying to get everywhere at this point. And then just giving it a few solid coats of that Steel Legion Drab. And the final results are here. And frankly, I'm so proud of how it looks. I think it's excellent. One of my best units yet, I think, actually. I would love to actually make a whole chapter of these guys, but for one, the lore is this guy's the last of his chapter, and for two, it took a fair bit of kit bashing from a few different kits, so not really feasible, unless I get myself some very fancy 3D printer, of course. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this build and painting session, guys. Now, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all that jazz if you want to stay tuned for any things going down. I mean, I'm currently just starting building an Alpha Legion army, and the first of that stuff will be uploaded very, very soon, so do indeed stick around for that. And of course, if you want to help support what I do, consider becoming a YouTube member or a Patreon member. Thank you for watching. I'm Artefexus, and remember, the Emperor is always guiding your brush.